Hello and welcome to another episode of Podcast Professional Dialogues. Today we have with us Mr. Tom Acland, the CEO of 3DExcite at Dassault Systemes. Tom, thank you very much for taking out the time and for talking to us.
Thank you, Mayank. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's the culmination of a great 10 days here in India.
Lovely. Tom, you represent 3DExcite, so I would want to ask you the first question. Over the course of the pandemic, we've seen a perceptible shift towards digital in the automotive industry. So how has technology played its role there?
So I think like many parts of the symptoms or the outcomes of the pandemic, what we've seen is an acceleration. So of course, these trends were present before we went into those lockdown situations. And over the course of that of these 2 years, we've been in and out of lockdowns in various places around the world. Dynamics that were already present in the industry have just accelerated probably by 10 years in the space of 2. So I can give you some examples in the taken from the interactions we have with our clients as we prepare the content which they use to present their offerings to end customers. As much as 75–80% of sales that were taking place during those periods where we were most restricted were taking place in a solely digital fashion. And I don't think we were seeing those kind of numbers before the pandemic. And obviously now the game has changed for good because people's attitudes and their behaviors have changed as a result. And the techniques available to both OEM and retail have evolved as a result of the challenges we faced. And I don't think we're going to go back in time.
So Tom, do you still believe that now when things are improving, people are coming out of their homes and, we are seeing things opening up? Do you think this trend is going to remain? You mentioned 75–80% of the volumes during the pandemic, during the peak of the pandemic, coming through the digital channels. But now, do you think that remains there, or do you think there's going to be a drop in the overall contribution of digital in the retail sales of car or vehicle companies?
It's a good question, because I think certainly we've seen some kind of elasticity in other areas. We've seen content consumption, for example, or some of the entertainment formats that were being delivered through purely digital means have kind of, to a certain extent, reverted in recent months. But I think that's really also a factor of our need to meet people and to interact with each other in the real world. And I think that is something very human that will be there, forever. We don't really want to be shut in our own four walls and separated from other people. We want to interact with others and discuss topics and really learn about things and experiment and so on. So I think to a certain extent we will see that in the numbers. There will be a resurgence of the meaning and the delight that customers have in interacting with representatives of a brand or a service partner in the real world. I think we will see footfall increase. In fact, we are already seeing that. But I think what's happening is that the role of those interactions is changing from something which is more focused on the transaction and more focused perhaps on managing a portfolio of customer contacts into something which is more of a contribution to the customer journey and the adhesion to the brand. And I think this is going to accelerate. And it's not just because of the pandemic, but actually because of the shift that's taking place in the automotive industry as a whole. As the vehicles themselves become more intelligent, more connected, and more able to adhere themselves to the customer or become part of an experience ecosystem which customers interact with, rather than just the ownership phenomenon of having the vehicle and transacting in a purely one-off fashion like that. I think the role of the dealership and the role of the service partner is going to change very radically into more of a meeting place, into more of a place to understand a little bit better what the value proposition of that particular brand is. And so I think we will see footfall increase, but I'm not sure that we will see the transactional part of the process returning wholeheartedly to dealers. On the other hand, one of the other interesting phenomena that we've seen is that prior to the pandemic, and also to a certain extent prior to the introduction of these new generation of vehicles that we're seeing coming onto the market, so these things kind of happen concurrently. It's difficult to say which is which. Obviously, OEMs tended to be less interested in supporting the sale of used cars than they were of selling new cars. I mean, that's obvious. But we're seeing very many brands actually starting to incentivize and support the sale of used cars. And that isn't just because they have an inventory problem. It's because they're looking to attach to the sale of the vehicle those mobility services which create the longer term relationship with clients or with customers. So I think it's very clear to see that the physical presence and the ability to interact with people who represent those quite complex value propositions will be a core part of establishing a brand and driving a business in the future.
You brought up used cars, Tom. So, do you think that the role of technology is getting a little bit more intense in the used car space? Because, therein, I mean, you can leverage the technology a little better compared to a new car because, every car is different and, you can get into the specifics of every model by leveraging technology. Are you seeing that happening right now?
Yeah, 100%. So we used to see the cadence of the industry really revolve around the introduction of new vehicles. And to a certain extent, that's still going to be the case because this is, the point at which new things enter the market. So there's always going to be a bit of an extra buzz about the introduction of new vehicle platforms. But I think for a couple of reasons, that is somewhat being augmented by innovation, which is coming in as vehicles are already on the street. So we're seeing software over the air updates, adding new features and new benefits to vehicles, as well as the evolution of an ecosystem of applications and different ways of accessing. There's almost that vehicle infrastructure, you could say, becoming part of the evolution of the value proposition, even as the vehicles are in the field. So the sort of big bang moment of a car launch is somewhat becoming, let's say, relatively less important to the ongoing development of the value proposition of a vehicle throughout its life. And I think if we looked at total customer value, we would see the shift towards those more digital business models actually as people consume cars and not just as they buy them for the first time.
Tom, you mentioned that, COVID has accelerated this shift towards digitalization. So as OEMs right now, what are the feedback you're getting or what is the requirement from OEMs you're getting right now? How are they planning their future strategies from here in terms of, marketing their products and, retail of their products? Because you mentioned that, physical is also coming back. So probably going forward, there has to be a hybrid model, a sort of a phygital approach.
100%.
So as an OEM, is that the trend you're seeing right now?
Yes, it is. So we're seeing obviously the launch of a new wave of product innovation, particularly linked to the arrival of electrification. So this is clearly happening everywhere, in every brand. But one of the interesting things that happens when you introduce electric vehicles is actually the systems architecture of those vehicles changes at the same time. So they become essentially, a digital asset with all kinds of interfaces which you can augment through virtual experiences. And obviously there were manufacturers that were very early into this, and they aggregated a lot of the functions that were distributed around the vehicle into a central software-defined architecture, which allowed them to upgrade the car very rapidly. But there have been, this has become, I would say, more I wouldn't say the status quo, but it's become more of the focus for vehicle development from an OEM perspective. I don't think that necessarily had too much to do with the pandemic. I think it was coming anyway. But certainly there is a change in the landscape. And what that means is there's kind of the industry is kind of on two clocks. We've got the industry, which is, working obviously on the products which are already launched and which, will for a certain amount of time still exist in the channel and ultimately in the field. So we still need to support them, and we still need to support all of the channel associated with how those are distributed. But ultimately, the new wave of vehicles that are coming in from an OEM perspective are going to, have a really, really big impact, and are having a big impact on how those vehicles are commercialized. They may still be introduced through a dealership model, for example. But of course, in terms of how they continue to extend their value over time, that's largely going to be driven, through technology, and ultimately the OEM will have a big part to play in that. Simply because it's really only the OEM who can kind of add the software components on the vehicle itself, which are necessary to enhance the capabilities of the vehicles for customers. So that, I would say, is the biggest shift. The introduction of EV is not just about batteries. It's much more about the software revolution that takes place as you make the car actually a little bit simpler in terms of its construction, in terms of its configuration. But you would make it a lot more complex in terms of its ability to project value or to differentiate value to people who wanted to do different things at different times.
Right. So you represent 3DExcite, this brand. So, how is 3DExcite playing its part in this entire shift right now?
So, for many, many years, we've been helping manufacturers, particularly in the car, in the automotive industry, transform and augment information related to how vehicles are engineered into content which is understandable for the users who might be interested in buying those vehicles. We've been doing that for nearly 2 decades. So we've got very, very good at that transformation, moving between CAD, the computer-aided design world, and the media world, which is used to advertise and expose cars' capabilities in the sales process. But what 3DExcite is, what's changing 3DExcite right now is what's changing manufacturers. Because the minute you start to get into a conversation where new features need to be presented, or even the vehicles themselves can change over time, you have to move the focus really towards how you present those new features every single day, and how you support the illustration of the capabilities of those vehicles, not only through the OEM's masthead, so through the OEM's own brand, but also possibly through other channel brands which are arriving in terms of offering access to those capabilities. So many of these mobility service offerings are not first-party labeled. They could be a completely different brand that's actually offering the access to the capabilities of the vehicle. I'm afraid I don't know the Indian market well enough to give you an exact the name of what those companies would be here, but I think this phenomenon is universal, and we're seeing it as much here in India as we are elsewhere. That there is still a retail, there is still a channel. It's just that this channel is becoming more about individual transactions that happen as and when we want to use vehicles, rather than a long lead CRM process about how we sell them. So that's clearly changing how 3DExcite thinks about preparing content based on the vehicle definition. As those worlds collide, the vehicle definition and the way we experience the value of the vehicle you can't do it any other way. It needs to be conjoined, so that as the vehicle changes, the representation of that from a value proposition perspective changes too.
Last question, Tom, with the shift in technology, in the basic fundamental propulsion technology in the automotive industry, we're moving towards electrified vehicles, EVs, and a lot of safety technology is also coming in, ADAS and autonomous driving is going to become reality in the coming future.
Yeah.
So how are you going to see the role of digital technologies, like yours at 3DExcite? How is that going to play its role in the coming future, and what is your outlook about it?
As I said, I think the outlook is very rosy. Well, I'm an optimist. I think you kind of got to be an optimist if you want to be the CEO. But I'm an optimist, and I think that this shift will, as I said, help us deliver more value while we consume less in terms of production. So that's the sort of top level. Moving down beneath that, what that basically means is that we need to be able to understand what people actually want to do, and we want to make an offering to them which is applicable to their needs at any moment in time. Knowing that, we're not just talking about ownership anymore, we're talking about access to shared resources. We're looking at how even those resources themselves can contribute back to a bigger ecosystem. And that means essentially being able to express the capabilities of a vehicle as it is in the field, in the context of something that a customer is trying to do through an app, or ultimately through some kind of metaverse technology, whatever it may be. And we see that as a very big opportunity actually for 3DExcite specifically. We're no longer just talking about translating CAD into an ad, right? We're talking about continually evolving the information which is available to application developers and to artists to allow them to communicate the value of these products as they mature and as they change and as they adapt themselves to the needs of customers. So that is something which is really very difficult to do if you're just looking at it as a pure discrete process. And I think that puts 3DExcite and Dassault Systemes in a very good position to support the transition on the OEM side, but also to enable software developers who are looking at a specific vertical, for example, or a specific need. For example, how do I make vehicles more accessible to people with disabilities? Or how do I solve a particular problem in a vertical, like, for example, I want to allow service and maintenance use cases being able to work in a complex city environment. So we're going to see a lot of brands and a lot of value propositions above the vehicle arriving, taking advantage of these services that we're able to provide to give all of those applications developers information about vehicles to enrich their experiences and make the value of the vehicle behind more understandable to the people using the service.
Lovely. On that note, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Mayank. It's been a pleasure talking to you.